Smith, writing in 1776, condemned what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans. He was referring to the barbarian invasion that took off from northwest and western Europe and swept over much of the world. By his day already was laying waste to much of the world, devastating the richest areas. The richest areas were places like what is now called Bangladesh or Haiti, which were regarded by the conquerors as absolute paradises. Clive, the British conqueror of what's now Bangladesh, was amazed by its wealth and industrial advancement and so on. He compared its capital city, which is now Dhaka, to London, so they were comparable, and the same was true in Haiti. Those were probably the two richest parts of the world, most populated, agriculture, etc. So that, and Adam Smith already knew that. And that's what he was referring to when he talked about the savage injustice of the Europeans. The British colonists, around who we are benefiting, we're benefiting from their activities, they were already well advanced in dealing with, well, I'll quote, that hapless race of Native Americans, which we are exterminating with such merciless and felicitous cruelty. That's quoting John Quincy Adams, but many years after he had completed his own extremely gruesome contribution to these actions, and was beginning to feel some penitence about them. His own particular actions are quite important historically. They include the first executive war in American history, the conquest of Florida, which is a typical modern-style executive war, like Kennedy's attack against South Vietnam, to refer to another thing that only existed in history, not in ideology. The conquest of Florida was in defense, John Quincy Adams explained. It was in defense against hordes of lawless Indians and Negroes who had fled to Florida, and we had to defend ourselves against them, so they carried out this monstrous war, the first Seminole War, which is now celebrated by the fact that Florida State, or one of those places, its motto is the Seminoles, which is kind of like the Jews and the Gypsies being the mottos for, say, Freiburg and Hamburg and so on. I should say one of the historians who's written about this mentioned that John Quincy Adams' favorite slogan was from Tacitus. It was the phrase, "Crime once exposed has no refuge but audacity," and that's a good slogan. And it's been used over and over again since John Quincy Adams justified that war of self-defense against the hordes of lawless Indians and Negroes. And I keep it in mind because that's one of the turning points. We're back to self-defense of that kind these days. I'll come back to that if there's time. Well, anyhow, as I say, Adams did recognize what had been done, the extermination of the hapless race of Native Americans. I'm sure you all know that around here anyway, since the Commander-in-Chief, Amherst, Lord Jeff, who was the highest authority in America, was also the person who initiated germ warfare. He was considered committed not to extermination, but rather to what he called extirpation of the natives. It was a little different, and giving smallpox blankets from the fort at Fort Pitt was his idea of how to extirpate them. And again, obviously that's taught in elementary schools here, so I don't have to go on with the story. But Adam Smith was also talking about that. There's a name for that these days. It's called the North-South divide. That's the result of the barbarian conquest that spread over the world, the North-South division or something like that. Kind of sounds nice. In the 18th century, even at the time when Adam Smith was denouncing the savage injustice of the Europeans, the South, what are now called the South and the North, First and Third World, they were more or less identical in most objective measures. Now, of course, there's an enormous difference between them. There are a number of reasons for this. You can decide what weight to give them, but one fundamental reason is surely the doctrine of markets, half of the story tonight. But the doctrine of markets, what's now called neoliberalism, but it's the way it was used in its really existing form. That's not the doctrine, but the reality. The really existing form of markets, and that remains true today, is a double-edged doctrine. It's market discipline for the poor, but plenty of protection and public subsidy for the rich. And that's about as close as to universality, close to a law as history provides. The market discipline for the poor, new term for it is tough love, because it's so good for them. But if you go back to, say, David Ricardo, he didn't use the phrase tough love, but he also explained that it's good for the poor. You harm the poor by helping them, and what's more, he proved that with the certainty of the laws of gravitation, he informed us. But of course, you help the rich by protecting them. That was the other side, which you didn't talk about. So Indian industry was being destroyed at that time by force and by high protectionist tariffs, while British industry was being developed. And in fact, England had 150 years of harsh protectionism before it ever considered the idea of allowing free markets, figuring it was so far ahead it could win for a while. That's, as I say, very close to a law of history. We're seeing it right now in Washington, so I'm not talking about past history, dramatically, in fact. There are some exceptions, and it's interesting to look at. The major exception, there's one part of the South that did develop, namely Japan, which happens to be, doubtless by accident, the one part of the South that resisted the European invasion and was there with some of its colonies in tow, and was therefore able to use the very same policies of state intervention in the economy and public subsidy and so on that invariably played a central role in the development of all the advanced countries of the North. Japan, incidentally, was a brutal imperial power, but it happened to treat its colonies quite differently from the Europeans. It didn't rob them, it developed them. So if you look at what's now called Taiwan, Formosa and Korea, in the first 40 years or so of the century, when they were Japanese colonies, they developed fast, about as fast as Japan, maybe more so. And in fact, starting with the 60s, they kind of picked up that former development. That's quite different from, say, the Philippines, to take a close-by place. So there are some exceptions, like there's one part of the South that did develop, also the one part that wasn't subjected to the savage injustice of the Europeans. You can draw your own conclusions from that. There's also some exceptions in the North. So there's one country of Northern Europe that still has very much third world characteristics, namely Ireland, the first colony. It was brutally attacked by the English barbarians, primarily Cromwell. Its development was barred by very harsh protectionism, same as India. It was subjected to free market principles. It was very much subjected to them. I'm sure you all know that. We're now commemorating the 150th anniversary of the huge famine that was caused by that. Ireland was not only was its development blocked, it was actually depopulated. And it was about half the population of what it had in the early 19th century. So there are exceptions on both sides, but there's some consistencies about those exceptions. If you look more closely, you'll find even more. All of this continues right now. As I said, we're seeing it quite dramatically in Washington, where the traditional North, and here is one of the real turning points in modern history, the traditional policies that divided the North from the South, the double-edged market principles, now they're being applied right here. That's somewhat new. Ricardo wanted to do it that way, and the British wanted to do it in the 1820s, but they couldn't get away with it, too much resistance. But now they're doing it, and it's being done by a very deliberate and very conscious application of social policy designed to turn the United States into a kind of a third world country. A third world country, it means very sharply two-tiered society with a sector of enormous wealth and privilege, a huge mass of people who are miserable, and another mass of people who are totally superfluous, who you send to death squads after or something like that. Here we don't quite do that. We throw into jail at a rate way beyond any other industrial country, and the death penalty is well beyond any industrial society. Juveniles in jail and facing the death penalty in the United States are off the spectrum, but that's not death squads exactly yet. But that's the idea, and what you're watching in Washington is precisely that. I'm not going to go into it in much detail. I assume you all know about it. Oddly, after 6 months of intense propaganda, under 40% of the population in the United States have ever heard of the contract with America, which is an interesting fact. But I'm sure you're among that 40%, so I'm not going to go into the details. Anyway, that's what I just described in a nutshell as sort of the story. Half the story. The other half is massive public subsidy and intervention on behalf of the wealthy and the privileged. I'll say a few words about that. So protection for the rich, market discipline for everyone else, the same tough love that turned Bengal and Haiti and Latin America and the Philippines, et cetera, into what they are today. And it's happening in really fine detail. If there's enough time, I'll give some examples. So coming back to the Clinton doctrine, I think it's kind of half true. We are going from containment, and to borrow another Cold War term, we're going to rollback. From containment to rollback, I think, and in my view, the right way to say this is that for centuries, there has been a dedicated effort to contain the threat of democracy and of human rights and even markets, for the rich at least. And since the 1970s, for interesting and important reasons, there has been a rather successful effort to roll back the gains that were achieved in a century of bitter popular struggle and to instill even more deeply than before the double-edged concept of markets that has always prevailed, meaning great for you, but not for me, please. Well, the primary methods remain what they indeed have always been, namely state power in the hands of those who control the domestic society. And again, the matter's well understood, and I'm simply repeating standard observations of old-fashioned conservatives. So take, say, Adam Smith again. He was writing about 18th century England, not 20th century America, but what he pointed out was quite apt, that state power was in the hands of what he called the merchants and manufacturers of England. They were, he said, the principal architects of state policy, and they used it to ensure that their own interests were most peculiarly attended to. He said it nicer than I am, but that's the same point. However grievous the effect might be on others, including the people of England, he didn't have the data to prove it at that time, but he guessed that the people of England were probably suffering from the policies that enriched the rich, and it's probably true in retrospect. Empires, it doesn't make sense to talk about nations as entities in world affairs. Adam Smith understood this. Unless you do what later came to be called class analysis, which he took for granted, you're not even talking about the real world. When people try to talk about this today, they're always accused of being vulgar Marxists, which is a very bad thing. But in fact, what they're being is old-fashioned conservatives, just repeating what was perfectly obvious common sense before the doctrinal system had reached the point where it could drive elementary truths out of people's minds. So then it became, sort of a lefty doctrine instead of perfectly obvious common sense as it was to Adam Smith.